Now, considering Honduras as an undemocratic country with weak institutions, low standards, insignificant strategic interests, and a record of serious human rights abuses, New Democrats believe that the majority of Canadians would not agree that preferential trade terms be accorded such a nation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased today to rise in this House for my first speech of 2014 and welcome all my colleagues back to speak today about the Canada-Honduras Free Trade Agreement. This agreement represents yet another important step in the diversification of our trade relationships around the world and our efforts to find new markets and to grow markets for Canadian goods and services. The priority of our government has been focused on opportunity and prosperity for Canadian families. This begins and ends with ensuring that our producers and firms have new markets to trade their wares. Trade leads to employment, Mr. Speaker, and prosperity for Canadian families. Whether the towns of Bowmanville, Port Perry or Uxbridge in my riding, or indeed the cities and towns across the country, families are made stronger by the simple fact that mom or dad can find meaningful employment if they want to be engaged in the workplace. In fact, Canadian exports already account for an astonishing 1 in 5 Canadian jobs. Over 40,000 Canadian companies are global exporters. Canadian companies and their innovative products are leaders in sectors ranging from aerospace, transportation, agriculture, to information and communications technology. With trade being critical to Canada's prosperity, Canada has long been a key architect of international trade rules at the World Trade Organization, through the Free Trade Agreement with the United States, and ultimately with NAFTA. Our country relies upon strong international agreements and treaties to counter protectionism and keep global markets open for our employers. We remain very engaged and positive about our most important trade relationship with the United States. Trade with the United States has been a defining part of the Canadian story. From North-South mercantile trade before Confederation, to the national policy of Sir John A., to the free trade agreement signed by the Conservative government in 1988, trade with our American friends has brought prosperity to generations of Canadian families, Mr. Speaker. The need to diversify Canadian trade relationships has been raised for decades because of a growing dependence on trade with the U.S., and this need to diversify came into sharp focus with the global recession in 2008. In 2008, Canadian exports to the United States totaled $368 billion. The following year, amid the global economic crisis, these exports dropped to $270 billion. While there has been a recovery in the U.S. economy and exports have been rebounding, statistics from 2012 show that our exports to the U.S. still remain 10% below 2008 levels. The strong economic leadership of our Prime Minister and this government has helped Canada weather the global turmoil better than most developed countries. But we cannot rest on our laurels when it comes to trade. We also must come up with a dual strategy that builds and strengthens our critical trade relationships now, while also building new and growing markets to sell our goods and services. The global economy, Mr. Speaker, is changing rapidly, and new markets are exploding around the world. Trade is helping lift millions out of poverty, while also promoting peace and security through stronger international engagement. Canada needs to pursue these new markets that are growing with gusto. We need to not only keep up with our global competitors, but to leverage our natural advantages to penetrate new markets faster and deeper than our competitors. Standing still will not create jobs for Canadian families, and over time, inaction could erode our position in the world and our quality of life. This is why our government has responded with an ambitious international trade agenda, opening new markets for Canadian companies, large and small, is cornerstone to this plan as we continue to grow the Canadian economy and the jobs in our economy created as a result of trade. We've made significant progress on opening new markets for Canadian goods and services. Last October, the Prime Minister announced an agreement in principle on the Canadian-European Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement, the most ambitious trade agreement Canada has ever negotiated. Our agreement with the European Union will give Canadian companies preferential access to an economy of more than 500 million consumers and a 17 trillion GDP. Tremendous opportunity, Mr. Speaker. A joint study by Canada and the EU as part of our negotiations concluded that our agreement with the European Union could boost Canada's GDP by $12 billion annually and increase bilateral trade by 20%. Most importantly, Mr. Speaker, the deal could result in the creation of 80,000 net new jobs once the benefits of the Canada-EU trade agreement are realized. While the Canada-EU trade agreement represents the culmination of many years of work with a group of nations, with our provincial stakeholders, with industries, with the municipalities who are eager to access the 500 million consumers of Europe, our government has also been tirelessly pursuing trade opportunities in markets of all sizes. Since 2007, our government has concluded free trade agreements with Peru, Colombia, Jordan, and Morocco. New agreements and relationships are being struck, while existing ones are being expanded. We have also concluded or brought into force 22 new or updated foreign investment promotion and protection agreements to provide better access to growing global markets for Canadian exporters, while also providing more certainty in these markets through the secure framework that a foreign investment promotion and protection agreement offers. It gives me great pleasure, Mr. Speaker, to advise this House that Honduras will soon be yet another market that we have opened for Canadian employers through this Canada-Honduras Free Trade Agreement. While our EU deal represents Canadian opportunities across the pond for our exporters, there are also tremendous opportunities here in the Americas. Total merchandise trade between Canada and the countries in the Americas stands at $56.2 billion in 2012. This has increased by 32% in the last 6 years alone. Canadian direct investment in the Americas totals $168 billion in 2012 and has increased by 59% over the same period. We are already engaged in South and Central America, and our government knows that we need to do more in our own backyard. Canada's trade agenda is not just about the planes, trains, and automobiles we manufacture in Canada, the great ones to boot, nor does it only represent natural resources and agricultural products. We are increasingly pursuing markets for our intellectual property, our academic excellence, and our delivery of professional services around the world. Canada is very much engaged in negotiations surrounding the Trade and Services Agreement, which will provide a secure legal framework and new market access for Canadian service suppliers in many of the world's most important and growing service markets. We also remain an active participant in multilateral negotiations at the World Trade Organization, where just a few weeks ago, Canada helped to conclude a trade facilitation agreement which will boost trade by cutting red tape for Canadian companies. But, Mr. Speaker, we're not just stopping there. Canada is also committed to advancing our ongoing free trade negotiations with other partners in the Caribbean, in Morocco, and here in the Americas. We are also looking for new opportunities to grow Canada's international trade and are undertaking exploratory discussions with Thailand and Turkey to determine what benefits Canadians and Canadian employers could see from trade agreements with these partners in the future. In addition, we continue to update our existing free trade agreements in order to ensure that Canada remains a global leader in trade and commerce. We recently announced the modernization of the Canada-Chile Free Trade Agreement. This expansion and modernization builds on an agreement that dates back to 1997 and a trade relationship that is now worth over $2.5 billion. The updated agreement with Chile includes the addition of a new financial services chapter, which will help world-class Canadian financial institutions develop new markets in the areas of banking, insurance, and asset management in Chile. It also includes new roles on government procurement, customs procedures, and dispute settlement. As you are aware, Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister announced last week that we will also modernize our existing free trade agreement with Israel. The Canada-Israel Free Trade Agreement really has been a cornerstone of a growing and important relationship for our country. While our countries enjoy a sophisticated trade relationship, an updated free trade agreement with Israel will enhance bilateral commercial flows by reducing technical barriers, enhancing cooperation, increasing transparency in regulatory matters, and reducing transaction costs for exporters. It will also create greater visibility for Canadian companies in the Israeli and Middle Eastern market and support closer ties with this dynamic economy and important democracy in the Middle East. Mr. Speaker, it's clear that the government is working hard to ensure that Canadians reap the economic benefits of global trade, which I said at the outset accounts for 1 in 5 jobs in Canada. The Canada-Honduras Free Trade Agreement is part of our efforts to liberalize trade with our partners here in the Americas. It is also a realization of our Global Markets Action Plan, which will grow existing and important trade relationships while forging new ones around the world. The Americas offer great potential. Trade has been growing dramatically in the last 6 years, as I said. We also need to promote increased mutual economic sharing of ideas and increase engagement. Canada's strategy for engagement in the Americas focuses on intensifying trade promotion and relationship-building efforts to ensure that the Canadian private sector can take full advantage of the trade and economic agreements, as well as helping to build the capacity of our trading partners to capitalize on the benefits of free trade with Canada and the benefits that come along with a growing and emerging middle class in many of these countries. Canada is committed to a strong economic partnership with Honduras that will contribute to enhanced prosperity and sustainable economic growth for both our countries in the long term, Mr. Speaker. This Canada-Honduras Free Trade Agreement is a key component in advancing the goals of Canada's strategy for engagement in the Americas and will support our growing commercial and social relationship with that country. Canada's two-way merchandise trade with Honduras grew by 46% in the last 6 years. Canadian companies are active in Honduras in the areas of apparel production and mining, but there are other sectors of huge potential opportunity, such as green building, clean technologies, information and communications technologies, to name just a few, Mr. Speaker. Once implemented, the Canada-Honduras Free Trade Agreement will eliminate tariffs on 98% of the tariff lines going both ways. We will gain better access to a growing market in our hemisphere with grain and oil seeds, beef, pork, potatoes, and processed foods being some of the early and big winners, and the potential for more industries and particularly service areas as the relationship with Honduras develops over time. Canada's Trade Commissioner Service already works with Canadian companies that are interested in doing business in Honduras. These are recognizable and important employers across Canada, Mr. Speaker. We'll recognize these names: Gildan Activewear, Aura Minerals, and Canadian Banknote, to name just a few. Once the trade agreement is ratified, our trade commissioners will ensure that companies, in particular small and medium-sized enterprises, are aware of how they can benefit from this free trade agreement so that they can take full advantage of the greater transparency, stability, and protection the agreement will provide in the Honduran market. In addition to opening doors for Canadian companies and building our trade relationship, Canada is also committed to supporting Honduras in other ways. Canada and Honduras first established diplomatic relations in 1961 and have a broad and diverse relationship driven by a wide range of links and collaboration, from political dialogue and commercial exchange to people-to-people ties, as well as a long-standing and substantial Canadian development component. We maintain an open dialogue with the government of Honduras, as we believe that engagement is the best way for us to help Honduras meet its challenges, grow its economy, and promote stability. Engagement on all levels will grow prosperity and security for Hondurans. As one of the 20 countries of focus for Canada's development assistance, Honduras is Canada's largest bilateral program in Central America and the fourth largest in the hemisphere. In 2011-2012, Canada provided over $39 million to the country through all development channels. This makes it the third largest bilateral donor in all of Honduras and the sixth largest overall donor in that part of the hemisphere. Canada's development program will support and promote economic opportunities in Honduras in a way that will allow our trade with Honduras to grow steadily over time. Mr. Speaker, it is our view that prosperity, security, and democratic governance, including full respect for human rights, are interconnected and mutually reinforcing. Increased prosperity through trade can contribute to the reduction of poverty and social exclusion by increasing economic opportunity for all Hondurans. Once ratified, this free trade agreement will be a cornerstone of our bilateral relationship with Honduras and will benefit both our countries. This is a comprehensive trade deal that will give Canadian businesses a secure and predictable framework in a growing Honduran marketplace. The United States and the European Union already enjoy free trade with Honduras, so it is especially important that we ratify this agreement and put Canadian companies on a level playing field with our main competitors. Let me turn to some specific examples of the benefits from the Canadian-Honduras trade agreement. First and foremost, it will help make Canadian products more attractive in the Honduran market by eliminating tariffs. Today, Canadian exports to Honduras face, on average, tariffs in the 11% range for agriculture and the 5% range for non-agricultural goods. Once the agreement is in place, Honduras will immediately eliminate tariffs on almost 70% of its tariff lines in respect to goods imported from Canada. This agreement, Mr. Speaker, represents an important component of our government's Global Markets Action Plan. This plan, Mr. Speaker, collaborates the funding and expertise inherent in our foreign policy, in our trade, and in our development arms, and focuses them in countries where we can make a difference, recognizing that benefiting the social and human rights of a country will also help benefit their local economy, and recognizing that jobs for Hondurans will help promote stability in the country. Mr. Speaker, this government is on an unparalleled track for promoting trade of our goods and services across the world. The Canada-EU trade agreement represents a huge leap in terms of global trade agreements, in that it will provide opportunity for Canadian exporters to a market of 500 million people, while also allowing penetration right down to services, mutual recognition of professions. It really is taking trade agreements into this new millennium that we're in, Mr. Speaker. In my community, in my riding of Durham, 1 in 5 jobs relate to trade, Mr. Speaker. The communities of Uxbridge, Scugog, and Clarington need these new markets for our goods, particularly at a time where the American market is slowly rebounding from the 2008 economic world crisis. Our government is firmly committed to building new markets for our goods and services to maintain this important role in job creation that trade promotes. These deals are not just with mammoth 500 million markets, like the Canada-EU trade deal, but they're also in important areas of the world, like in Jordan, Morocco, and now Honduras, where our trade and our prioritization of our services and our engagement through our Global Market Action Plan can not only promote trade in that country, but can also promote stability and promote engagement in a range of labour, environmental, and a plethora of areas. So, Mr. Speaker, this is a pivotal part of our government's Global Market Action Plan. It's a pivotal part of keeping Canadian families employed and engaged, and I'm truly hoping all members of this House will support this important agreement. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, New Democrats believe that Canadians recognize the importance of trade to our economy and want an effective, strategic trade policy that expands trade opportunities and supports Canadian exporters. We believe that Canadians want a trade policy that produces good jobs in our communities and encourages the development of value-added production to our many resources here in Canada. We believe that Canadians want a trade policy that strengthens our economic relationships with growing, significant economies that have strategic value to the Canadian economy. We believe that Canadians want trade agreements that preserve our ability to legislate in the public interest, protect our social programs, and promote local economic development. And we believe that Canadians want their government to pursue a balanced trade policy that builds trade and at the same time fosters positive democratic development, human rights and environmental standards both in Canada and in the nations with whom we trade. New Democrats also know that Canadians care about the process by which we implement trade policy. Canadians want an open, transparent and accountable process in all aspects of the development of trade policy and agreements. Canadians want and deserve to be consulted about their priorities and kept advised about the progress of trade negotiations. After all, they know that trade agreements are not negotiated on behalf of political parties or special interests. They are negotiated on behalf of all Canadians and all sectors of our economy. This is particularly the case, Mr. Speaker, as trade agreements have become more comprehensive and increasingly deal with areas of policy that have historically been considered to be of purely domestic concern. Now, since the Conservatives took office in 2006, by all objective measurements, Canada's trade performance has been deplorable. In 2006, the Conservatives inherited a current account surplus of some $18 billion. Today, after 8 years in power, Canada has a current account deficit of $62 billion. That is a negative swing of some $80 billion, an average decline of $10 billion for every year the Conservatives have been in power. Now, over the last 2 years, even as we have pulled slowly out of the global recession, Canada has experienced 23 consecutive months of merchandise trade deficits. We have also seen an alarming shift in the quality of our exports. Under the Conservatives, there have been an increase in the percentage of our exports that are raw or barely processed, reversing a decades-long trend towards an increase in our value-added products. Nor can this poor performance be explained away, Mr. Speaker, by the recession that Canada experienced between 2008 and 2011. A comparison by the Library of Parliament of Canada's trade performance to 17 other countries around the world between 2006 and 2012, countries who experienced the exact same global recession, collapse in commodity prices and currency fluctuations, found that Canada came dead last in current account performance. Now, this poor trade record is consistent with the Conservatives' poor performance economically across the board. A look at major economic metrics provides comprehensive evidence of this government's economic failure since they took office in 2006. Now, I hear laughing on that side. We'll see if they still laugh after these statistics. National unemployment rate in 2006 was 6.6%. Today, it's 7.2%. The youth unemployment rate in 2006 was 12.2%. Today, it's 14%. Among the 34 OECD nations in employment creation since 2006, Canada ranks 20th. The number of governments since 1935, the last 80 years, that presided over a slower rate of real economic growth per capita, 0. The percent of our federal debt that was accumulated since 2006, 1/5. The percentage increase in our real average manufacturing wage from 2006 to now, 0. And the percentage drop in productivity since the Conservatives came to power, a negative 1.9%. Now, the conclusion is obvious. The Conservatives have had 8 years to implement their trade and economic policies, and the unacceptable results are there for all to see. Now, the Bank of Canada has explicitly stated that a major contributing factor to Canada's stalled economic performance is due to our underperformance in the trade file. Mr. Speaker, Canada is a trading nation. Our economy is historically and continues to be substantially dependent on our export sector and increasingly, with global supply chains and integrated production, on our import experience as well. It is therefore vital that Canada implement a smart, effective trade policy and pursue well-negotiated, beneficial trade agreements with strategically important, growing and significant economies that will help Canadian businesses and create good jobs for Canadians. Now that brings us to the matter before the House, Bill C-20. With all the issues and deeply entrenched problems facing Canada's trade sector, what do the Conservatives bring to this Parliament today? They bring Canadians a free trade agreement with Honduras. Now, this is not surprising. Although the Conservatives like to brag about the trade agreements they've concluded in the last 8 years, the facts, again, tell a different story. In truth, they have concluded a total of 6 trade agreements with the following countries: Jordan, Panama, Peru, Colombia, a goods-only agreement with 4 small European countries, including Liechtenstein and Iceland, and now Honduras. As is obvious, these are agreements with small economies of limited strategic interest to Canada. Trade agreements with major developed and developing economies like Japan, India, South Korea, Brazil, China, South Africa. Agreements that would have a material and positive benefit for the Canadian economy if negotiated well, the Conservatives have been unable to conclude. New Democrats believe that we should apply 3 important criteria to assess trade agreements. 1. Is the proposed partner a democracy who respects human rights, adheres to acceptable environmental standards and Canadian values? And if there are challenges in these regards, can it fairly be said that they are on a positive trajectory towards these goals? 2. Is the proposed partner's economy of significant and strategic value to Canada? And 3. Are the terms of the proposed agreement acceptable? Mr. Speaker, the proposed free trade agreement with Honduras fails this test. Again, let's look at the facts and take a closer look at the country that this Conservative government wants Canadians to extend preferential trade benefits and closer economic relations to. Honduras is a country with a seriously flawed human rights record, weak institutions, corrupt police and army, and a history, both entrenched and recent, of repressive, undemocratic politics. The last democratically elected government, that of President Manuel Zelaya, was toppled by a military coup in June 2009. This coup was staged by the Honduran army under the pretext of a constitutional crisis that had developed between the Supreme Court and the President. Following the coup, the government suspended key civil liberties, including freedom of the press and assembly. In the ensuing days, security forces responded to peaceful demonstrations with excessive force and shut down opposition media outlets, causing deaths, scores of injuries, and thousands of arbitrary detentions. The coup was widely condemned around the world, including by all Latin American nations, the European Union, the United States, and the UN General Assembly. In January 2010, Porfirio Lobo Sosa assumed the presidency through what has overwhelmingly been deemed undemocratic and illegitimate means. Of course, holding an election mere months after the violent military overthrow of the elected administration is hardly an acceptable context for a free and fair election. Indeed, most foreign governments and election monitoring agencies refused even to send observers, and many countries rejected the results of the election. The recent election held in November of 2013 has similarly been condemned by independent observers. Now, since 2009, NGOs of all types have documented serious human rights abuses, extrajudicial killings, kidnappings of political figures, intimidation of citizens, severe restrictions on public demonstrations, protest, and freedom of expression, and interference in the independence of the judiciary are well established in Honduras. Now, here are some basic facts from independent sources about the situation in Honduras. Honduras ranks 85th out of 167 on the Economist Intelligent Unit's 2012 Democracy Index. That's a slide from being 74th. They're getting worse. Honduras is now classified as a hybrid regime rather than its previous designation as a flawed democracy. Transparency International ranks Honduras as the most corrupt country in Central America, no small feat. It is a major drug smuggling center, and it has the worst income equality in the region. The U.S. State Department estimates that 79% of all cocaine shipments originating in South America land in Honduras. Drugs move from South America through countries like Honduras and other Central American states into Mexico and the United States and Canada. Independent observers have noted the increasing levels of violence as well as organized criminal and gang activity associated with the trade in illegal narcotics. According to The Economist, the countries in the northern triangle of the Central American Isthmus, that includes Honduras, form, quote, what is now the most violent region on earth. The United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime reports that in 2011 there were 92 murders per 100,000 people per year in Honduras, making it the most violent country in Latin America. In 2012, Honduras became the murder capital of the world, reaching a record high of 7,172 homicides in 2012, or 81 per 100,000 people. In 2013, there have been on average 10 massacres per month, according to the investigative website Insight Crime, which defined massacre as an instance where 3 or more people were murdered at one time. In the previous 4 years, less than 20% of homicide cases have even been investigated, let alone prosecuted. As pointed out by the America's Policy Group, this high level of impunity serves to mask massive political violence. Since 2010, there have been more than 200 politically motivated killings, and Honduras is now regarded as the world's most dangerous place for journalists. According to a 2013 Human Rights Watch report, Honduras has the region's highest rate of journalists killed per capita, with some 23 having been assassinated in the last 3 years alone. According to Honduras National Human Rights Commission, 36 journalists were killed between 2003 and mid-2013, and 29 have been killed since President Lobo took office. Today, journalists in Honduras continue to suffer threats, attacks, and killings, and authorities consistently fail to investigate these crimes effectively. Peasant activists and LGBT individuals are particularly vulnerable to attacks, yet the government also routinely fails to prosecute those responsible. In June 2013, 24 U.S. senators signed a letter expressing concern about the human rights situation in Honduras. 94 members of Congress have called on the U.S. State Department to halt all military trade aid to Honduras in light of its violent repression of political activity. At least 16 activists and candidates from the main opposition party, Libre, were assassinated since June of 2012, and 15 more have been attacked. On August 25, 2013, just months ago, 3 leaders of the indigenous Tulapan were shot and killed. There are extensively documented cases of police corruption, with 149 extrajudicial killings by police recorded between January 2011 and November 2012 alone. In January 2013, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the Independence of Judges and Lawyers called the dismissal of 4 Supreme Court justices by the Honduran government a violation of international norms and a grave threat to democracy. This is what Mr. Neil Reeder, the Director General, Latin American Caribbean Bureau, in defate testified before a committee. Institutions in Honduras are weak. Impunity is pervasive and corruption is a challenge. Corruption within the Honduran police force is a particular problem which the government of Honduras recognizes, largely because Central America is situated between the drug-producing countries of South America and the drug-consuming countries to the north. Honduras has been particularly affected by the growth of transnational drug trafficking, human trafficking, and the impact of organized crime. Another element of the violence affecting Honduras is the presence of street gangs known as maras, which rely on extortion and other forms of crime as income. Honduras has more of these gangs than all other Central American countries combined, and their activities contribute to crime and insecurity in the country. Honduras has now the highest homicide rate in the world, 81 per 100,000, as compared to 1.8 per 100,000 in Canada. End quote. This, Mr. Speaker, is the profile of the country that this Conservative government wants Canada to extend preferential trade access and closer economic relations to. Now, in terms of significance to the Canadian economy, the facts reveal as follows. Honduras ranks 120th out of 186 countries on the United Nations Human Development Index. The World Bank categorizes Honduras as a lower middle-income country, and Honduras suffers from extremely unequal income distribution, extreme social inequality, high unemployment, poor health, and education. And this is the country that this government wants Canadian businesses to compete with. Honduras is currently Canada's 104th export market in terms of value of exports. 2012 merchandise exports total a meager $38 million. Imports are $218 million, marking a significant trade deficit. Internal defate analyses confirm marginal benefits only to the Canadian economy are expected from this deal. Although Canada's extractive sector has interest in Honduras, Canadian mining companies have been ensnared in controversial local struggles with citizens and Indigenous groups and face allegations of environmental contamination. In terms of the process used by the Conservatives to arrive at this deal, there has been a complete lack of transparency in the negotiation process of this trade agreement. Despite repeated demands by civil society in Canada, the Government of Canada failed to make public the text of the agreement during the negotiation process, and further, the government's token environmental impact assessment of this free trade agreement released in October omitted any assessment of the impact of Canadian investments in Honduras because these figures are considered, quote, confidential, quote. As is also the usual case with the Conservatives, they have allowed no opportunity for either this Parliament or Canadians themselves to comment upon or influence the agreement before it is signed. We are left with the choice of only voting yes or no. The labour and environmental side agreements are inadequate given that they are not accompanied by any real enforcement mechanism to ensure they are adhered to. Through the investment chapter of the Canada-Honduras trade agreement, corporations can sue the Canadian government in international tribunals, hindering Canada's ability to make decisions aimed at protecting the public good. Now, considering Honduras as an undemocratic country with weak institutions, low standards, insignificant strategic interests, and a record of serious human rights abuses, New Democrats believe that the majority of Canadians would not agree that preferential trade terms be accorded such a nation. What the New Democrat opposition wants is a strategic trade policy where we restart multinational negotiations, where we sign trade deals with developed countries who have high standards and developing countries who are on positive trajectories. These are countries like Japan, India, Brazil, South Africa. These are the countries that we should be signing trade agreements with, not undemocratic countries like Honduras, who are drug trafficking centres, human rights violators, and have low standards that will hurt Canadian business. Mr. Speaker, I can do no better than to adopt the words spoken by two Canadians, Mr. Gary Neal and Ms. Stacey Gomez. We really do not believe that it is good public policy for the government to be pursuing trade and investment agreements that are economically basically meaningless with volatile and undemocratic nations like Honduras. We have long maintained that under the right conditions, trade can generate growth and support the realization of human rights. These conditions simply do not exist in Honduras. Until there is a verifiable improvement in the country's democratic governance and human rights situation, the Canada-Honduras FTA will do more harm than good. I believe these are wise words, Mr. Speaker. New Democrats will vote against this agreement accordingly, and I urge all members who want trade to be a positive force in this world economically, politically, socially, and environmentally to join us in doing so as well. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We support Bill C-20, and the Liberal Party is strongly in support of the principle of free trade and free trade as an essential part of Canada's economic growth in the 21st century. I'd like to talk a little bit now about our broader vision of what we need to do with trade and how that fits into our overall economic vision, and then I'd like to talk about this specific agreement and how we need to work hard in implementing it to live up to the principles of Canadian democracy and how Canada wants to conduct itself in the world. On trade. Sorry, guys. You need smaller ones for the smaller people you have coming into Parliament. On trade. 19.2% of Canadians work in jobs that are directly in the export sector. and up to 80% of the Canadian economy, depending on how you count it, is dependent on exports. We're a small country in a vast globalized world economy, and without being open to that world economy, without being an active, energetic participant, we have no chance of thriving, and crucially, no chance of creating the middle-class jobs which we need and which we are failing to create in sufficient number and of sufficient quality right now. What we need, however, is not just a number of small piecemeal agreements with small countries like Honduras. What Canada needs to be successful is an economic vision and a trade vision which is much more ambitious, which is much wider reaching, and which fully and ambitiously integrates Canada into the global economy. So while we support this trade deal with Honduras, we believe that our country needs to be much more energetically engaging with other emerging market economies that are growing strongly and where we see the rest of the world competing now for a position. In particular, I would like to draw your attention, Mr. Speaker, to what's happening right now in Africa. A lot of us are accustomed to seeing Africa as a development story, as a poverty story. The reality of the new Africa today is this is one of the world's hottest emerging markets. Some of the leading countries in Africa have had, for more than 5 years, 5% economic growth year on year. This is real, this is huge. You are seeing investors pouring in, and you are seeing a competition between the big ambitious countries in the world, notably China and the US, for a strategic position in Africa. Where is Canada? That is a continent to which we urgently need to turn our attention when it comes to trade deals. And by the way, what a great way for us to have a positive impact on the world. The other part of an ambitious global economic agenda and global trade agenda for Canada is really thinking about where do we want to position our country in the world economy. We have to realize that right now we are living in a winner-take-all global economy. That applies to countries, it applies to individuals, and it applies to companies. And frankly, we are not seeing from today's government a sufficiently ambitious, a sufficiently forward-looking economic agenda for our country. One of my favorite books at the moment is a book by the economist Tyler Cohen called Average is Over. And his central contention is we are living in a moment when if you are the best company in a space, if you are the top talent in a space, if you're the top city, if you're the top country, you will succeed. But if you're in the middle, if you're just average, you have no future. That is a lesson that Canada desperately needs to learn and that the Canadian government needs to make the center of its policies. We need to be building an overall trade agenda, an overall economic vision in which we are creating in Canada a platform for being fully engaged in the world economy, but a platform from which we have companies headquartered in Canada doing business around the world rather than the old branch plant economy. That is not going to work. It is not going to create enough great jobs for the 21st century. This reality of an ambitious trade agenda, an economic agenda fit for the 21st century, we believe is going to become ever more apparent this year in 2014. We've heard from the Conservative benches already this week, the first week of our new session, a lot of assertions about Canada's economic excellence, how we're better than anybody else in the G7, and so on. That is going to be less true in 2014 as the other G7 economies, which suffered so greatly from the financial crisis that Canada was spared, thanks, I have to point out, to the wise bank regulation policies of the Liberal government in the 1990s. The other G7 economies have now healed. And you're going to see in 2014, we're already seeing it, a very strong comeback in the US, a strong comeback in the UK. Our relative performance is looking much worse already, and we're not even through the first month of 2014. And what that says to me, what that needs to say to all of us is We have coasted. We have coasted on the fact that we didn't have a financial crisis, and we have not put in place a powerful, forward-looking economic agenda that is going to build prosperity for the middle class in the 21st century. That includes trade. Piecemeal agreements with small countries, that's a good start, not too bad, but we need to be a lot more ambitious and have a much broader vision. When it comes to the Honduras deal in particular, I think my honorable colleagues in the NDP have raised the important point that this is a trade deal with a country that has a very troubled record and a very troubled reality on many political, labor, and environmental issues. We in the Liberal Party believe that it's important for us to do this deal. Not every country in the world is perfect, and we have to trade in the global economy, and we believe that having a strong trading relationship can and must be a way to be a positive force in those economies. That's true, but that will only work if it is more than words. And we have to, in implementing this trade deal, be very, very alive to what is going on in Honduras, to the possibility that by having a trade deal with this country, by having our companies engaged with Honduras, we can be complicit in political and environmental and labor violations. We don't just sign the deal and walk away. We have to watch really closely and be absolutely certain that we and Canada are behaving well. I'd like to point to the fact that rather than having a binding mechanism for labor and environmental standards in the side agreements, Article 1016 of the Free Trade Agreement states, quote, each party should encourage enterprises operating within its territory or enterprises subject to its jurisdiction to voluntarily incorporate internationally recognized standards of corporate social responsibility in their internal policies. That puts a very great onus on us to be aware, to watch, and to be absolutely careful that those standards, political, environmental, labor standards, are watched and are observed. I'd like to draw particular attention as the MP for Toronto Centre to the tremendous abuse, to the tremendous repression which the LGBT community faces in Honduras. This is something that even as we broaden and deepen our economic relationship with Honduras, we have to be absolutely alive to and watchful about. And we have to take great care that the Canadian companies that will be working there, that will be trading there, that will have a relationship with Honduras are not party to that and are in fact part of, through their example, acting against it. The labor and environmental standards, again, we have to be incredibly watchful about this. If, as the Labour Party believes, we are to use our trade agreements with troubled countries to be a force for moving those countries in a positive direction, we have to take incredible care. We have to take incredible care about the labor and environmental standards as well, because this is how we ensure that free trade is a great deal for the Canadian middle class. Without watching those labor and environmental standards, trade with a country which is poorer than Canada, like Honduras, can be dangerous for the middle class. So again, we can't simply sign a piece of paper and walk away. This trade deal has potential. That's why we support it. But we have to be extremely vigilant, and we must also move towards a broader vision, something much more than one single deal. Thank you very much.